So if we want to have an effective deterrent in those eastern countries that border Russia, then we have to have in place strong conventional military forces that can be seen to be effective and will carry out the deterrence mission. Much better to
Yeah.
spend some money deterring than have to fight a bloody conflict,
Mm.
rebuild countries, and all the other extraordinarily awful paraphernalia that comes with having to resist an armed conflict, such as the Ukrainians are experiencing at the present moment.
And time to invite you into our daily briefing room, where one of our leading tactical and strategic minds, one with years of experience as a general officer at the highest level of military command, share thoughts on the war in Ukraine. Let me welcome back then to the programme Lord Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff, Head of the Army. Richard, good afternoon to you.
John, good afternoon, good evening.
And good to have you on, Richard. Now tell me, are you brushing off your uniform? How are you celebrating the Jubilee this weekend?
Well, I watched the Trooping the Colour this morning on television, amongst getting ready for our village celebrations today, with lighting a beacon rather, at 10:15, and then we've got a big celebration on Sunday, and my wife and I will be in St Paul's Cathedral tomorrow morning. So we've got to get up early and get the train to London.
Okay, well, enjoy the Jubilee. Now, let me ask you this, then, Richard. I was reading a piece earlier on in the day, which was going through some of the lessons available now of the war in Ukraine, well over 100 days into the conflict, and the sort of things that were listed included the use of information, especially on social media, the value of drones, what we've learned about the value of tanks. What are your thoughts on those things, Lord Dannatt, and others besides? What has occurred to you?
Well, there's quite a range of things that you've suggested there, John. I think social media, as in every aspect of life, is very important these days. It's important as far as, well, for three audiences, really. The internal audience in Ukraine, which needs to be encouraged to go on resisting. The international audience needs to be informed as to what is happening, and that's really important. And then, of course, perhaps most critically, is the social media reach into Russia proper. But given that the Kremlin pretty much controls all state media, the way that the average Russian, I think, probably has any chance of knowing what's going on is through extended reach of social media. So that is particularly important.
Yeah.
You also mentioned information is important as far as social media is concerned. Battlefield information is critically important as well.
Yeah. I mentioned drones, which have become an interesting feature of this conflict.
Drones are important for a whole bunch of reasons, one of which is for their surveillance capabilities. Surveillance in terms of seeing what the enemy is doing, but also particularly surveillance in terms of acquiring targets that accurate artillery can engage. And then, of course, increasingly, we're seeing the use of armed drones that themselves can acquire targets and deliver explosive ordnance, particularly against armoured fighting vehicles, or indeed soft-skinned vehicles.
Yes.
Which probably brings us to the third point that you raised, which is the discussion about the effectiveness of tanks in the 21st century on the battlefield. I'm sure listeners of Times Radio don't read the Daily Telegraph, but there was quite an egregious piece in last Sunday's Sunday Telegraph, written by someone called Lewis Page, who's a very respectable commentator, except the fact he was a junior naval officer, who wrote an excoriating piece saying the day of the tank had gone. Well, I'm afraid most of us actually don't accept that. He seemed to base his suggestion that the day of the tank had gone on the woeful performance of Russian armour in the early days of this campaign. But that performance was woeful for every military reason that you could come up with. And it doesn't actually follow by extrapolation that main battle tanks have lost their place on the battlefield.
Yes.
A tank is a very important direct fire weapon. It's a protective way of moving people around, as indeed armoured infantry fighting vehicles are. And of course, where the history of warfare has always demonstrated its invention and counter-invention. Now, if the armed drone is now making tanks vulnerable, then the boffins of this world now need to bend their minds to find ways of making tanks more secure and able to counter armed drones flying above them. This discussion is not over by any manner of means.
And that's really interesting. I recall just a few weeks ago hearing the Prime Minister discussing the battle tanks as if they were now shown to be an obsolete weapon of war. Now, have we learned, as a complete layman, it strikes me that we seem to have learned quite a lot about the relative strength of the Russian military machine, certainly as placed against its Ukrainian enemy, but also in relation to NATO. Is that correct, do you think?
Well, it's correct to an extent. I mean, what it has confirmed, which we've known right back from the days of the Cold War, is that the Russians' ability to maneuver has been constrained a fair degree by their fairly ineffective means of communicating on the battlefield. Modern Western armies, all tanks, all armored fighting vehicles have got secure communication so that one vehicle can talk to another. This has not always been the case with Russian equipment. But what we have seen, and we are still seeing, is the incredible reliance that the Russians place on artillery. They've always had a tremendous amount of tube artillery, rocket artillery, field artillery. And this is what we're seeing in Luhansk and Donetsk provinces at the present moment. Yes, they have largely now captured Severodonetsk, but it's not as a result of determined infantrymen going forward with rifles, machine guns, and grenades.
Yeah.
It's as a result of massed artillery standing off and pounding defensive positions such that the infantry only has to then just go in and occupy them.
Yeah.
And this is why the Ukrainians have been crying out to the West to give them more artillery and more artillery with a longer range in order to be able to counter Russian artillery.
Right.
And that's a very legitimate and reasonable request.
Yeah, we know that the NATO members on the eastern border have been for years worried about the threat posed by Russia, and that obviously goes for the Baltic states too. In the light of experience of what has happened in Ukraine, would it be simply way overstating it to say that the idea of Russia posing a direct military ground threat to the NATO countries on its border is no longer realistic? And now with Denmark and Finland maybe moving towards membership of NATO too, we need no longer fear the idea of Russia posing a threat to NATO allies on its borders in the way that perhaps we were, at least in theory, worried just a short while ago.
Well, John, you can argue that, and it's quite seductive to argue that. It's particularly attractive to prime ministers and chancellors and finance ministers in Western countries if they were to convince themselves that therefore the need to invest in increased holdings and capabilities of conventional weapons was no longer required. But I'm afraid I don't think I can share that deduction.
No, it's not that the threat has disappeared in some magical way. It's that the balance of power sits so very clearly on the western side of those borders that we no longer need live in fear. As long as we maintain that strength.
We will only no longer live in fear if we have sufficient capability and visible capability and capability of a modern type,
yes,
whereby an adversary, in this case a resurgent Russia, actually knows that they could be overmatched by what we could respond with. And frankly, this is where NATO, post the end of the Cold War, has been taking peace dividend after peace dividend. And our holdings of conventional capability, you've only got to look at our own country, in Germany, of course, as well. A conventional capability really, really run down. So if we want to have an effective deterrent in those eastern countries that border Russia, then we have to have in place strong conventional military forces that can be seen to be effective and will carry out the deterrence mission. Much better to spend some money deterring than have to fight a bloody conflict, rebuild countries, and all the other extraordinarily awful paraphernalia that comes with having to resist an armed conflict, such as the Ukrainians are experiencing at the present moment.
Well, and that argument then really underlines the importance of maintaining the solidity of the Western alliance then, doesn't it? Not just keeping America engaged, as it seems to be fully engaged now alongside the United Kingdom and with Eastern NATO members shoulder to shoulder, but keeping countries like France, Italy and Germany absolutely in the same place as well. Because, I don't know, that lineup has seemed to have wobbled just a little bit over recent days and weeks.
Solidarity in NATO is extraordinarily important. It's probably stand fast Hungary, which is a bit of a loner as far as this is concerned. But all the other countries, Eastern European countries that border Russia, are absolutely clear that they have got a real threat on their border and are standing shoulder to shoulder. And countries like our own and the United States are very much supporting them. There are some other countries, maybe countries that are reliant too much still on Russian oil and gas and Russian trade, that want to take a rather softer approach. But I think the hard reality, and I think Western governments have got to accept this, is that NATO is strong if NATO is unified. NATO is strong if it's got adequate conventional capability that it can demonstrate to a potential foe that this capability is real, and it actually acts as a meaningful deterrent. And we rather lack that. I mean, take the case of the British Army. In the days of the Cold War, we had in the field 4 armoured divisions. We managed to put 1 armoured division into the field for both the First and Second Gulf War. We cannot put an armoured division into the field today. Indeed, we would struggle to put a capable armoured brigade into the field. Now, that degree of capability, and mirror that across other Western NATO allies, particularly Germany, is really, really very worrying. And Putin has spotted this. He also spotted other factors like the shambolic exit from Afghanistan last August, and he's been emboldened. And it's only the resolute behavior of the Ukrainians, now belatedly being propped up by Western arms and equipment,
Yes,
that has prevented a complete disaster.
and it amplifies and magnifies then the importance of Finland and Denmark as potential new members of the NATO alliance. Another 800 miles of NATO border with, in the case of Finland and Denmark, 2 really well equipped, well trained, well armed allies added to the alliance.
Well, you're right, but both Finland and Sweden, their regular full-time forces are relatively small. We're talking in terms of small numbers of tens of thousands. But in contrast to a country like our own, and it's countercultural in this country, they have got very large reserves. They've got young men who are conscripted and do a certain amount of military service. So when push comes to shove in an emergency, they can put a very large number of men and women in uniform with weapons capable of defending their country. That is the kind of total defense which, if you live with an 800-kilometer border with Russia, you really want to buy into. Now, we're fortunate. We're on an island. We've withdrawn our troops from Germany. We don't feel quite that same degree of threat. But Poland does. Other countries, the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they very much feel that. And Finland and Sweden joining NATO, I think it's the right thing for them to do. And that's the kind of capability which they've built up to protect their neutrality. And now they want to come under the umbrella of NATO. And I think from NATO's point of view and the West's point of view, this is to be welcomed.
Okay, Richard Dannatt, Lord Dannatt, thank you so much for joining us today. Fascinating to get your thoughts as ever. Former head of the British Army, joining us there in today's briefing room.